Today you will hear a new creepy story. Get comfortable, turn off the light, and immerse yourself in the atmosphere of night horror. My wife underwent a course of exposure therapy to cure her arachnophobia, but her treatment worked too well, and now she scares me. I don't like spiders. I don't like it when they bunch together so that their legs look like tangled wires. And I don't like it when they stretch out on their web as if a spoke in a bicycle wheel. Unfortunately, when I met my wife, we both found out that we were afraid of them. As a man, I just took on the duty of removing spiders when we see them. At first, I, with a squeal, tried to knock them off with a shoe from a distance, but over the years I got tired of such stress and anxiety. Fear is exhausting, jumping, screaming, and running. Over time, I found that I was less and less afraid of spiders. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want one of them to crawl on my face, but now at the sight of a spider, I don't run away in fear. Lily also never got along with them, but usually such simple fears are not treated with therapy. For the first 10 years that I knew her, she was an ordinary arachnophobe. Everything only got worse after that night when we came home from friends. There was a storm outside, the wind was blowing as if from hell. I remember how I put the keys on the table by the door, and when I looked back, Lily was taking off the hood of her coat. She sighed, ran her hands through her hair, and it seemed she felt something. When she ran her hand through her hair, I saw black legs sticking out of her clenched fist. It took her a second to realize what had happened. Then she threw everything that was in her clenched palm onto the floor. She screamed and ran back. It lasted literally a couple of seconds. Everything happened so fast. I saw the spider running under the nearest door. At that moment, my main task was comforting my wife, who had begun a full-on panic attack. "Get it off, get it off, get it off," she cried, slapping herself on her neck and hair. I hugged her tightly, checked her hair, and then checked again when she asked me to. Then she took off all her outer clothes to make sure nothing else had stuck to her clothing. Then I led her to the kitchen, and we drank a cup of tea each while she kept scratching the back of her head. "Fucking bastard," she cursed nervously. Her crying shifted into laughter. "I can't believe it. Did you see it? It was huge. One of the biggest I've seen," I said. To tell the truth, I had only vague memories of that moment. But yes, that spider really was big. One look at it made me feel anxiety, but at the time I ignored my own discomfort. After all, I was hardly the victim in this situation. And it had run away. She shrank into herself. "Oh God, it's still somewhere in this house, isn't it?" I wanted to lie, but changed my mind. "Yes, it's somewhere here," I said. "But tonight I'll make it so that not a single spider gets into our bedroom. And in the morning I'll look for it." "Thank you," she smiled sadly. "Jesus, tonight I'm definitely going to have a hard time falling asleep." She made me check the whole bed before she got into it. And all night she kept scratching her hair and the back of her head. I felt sorry for her. If this had happened to me, I don't know how I would have reacted to it. We both slept badly that night, but I mostly just worried about her. When you love someone, it's hard to see them suffer, but everything went far beyond one night. The second night was almost the same, the third, the fourth, and so on. In the second week, everything calmed down a little, but then she saw a spider in some TV show, and the anxiety returned in full force. Every night was the same. I had to remove all the sheets, lift the mattresses, and check whether there were spiders there. She even got rid of the bedside table so there would be fewer places where the spider could hide. And all this time I was on the hunt. I had to catch that bastard for her, otherwise she would never feel safe in this house again. Funny, but looking back, I can't say for sure whether I really saw that thing run under the door that first night, but I know that I didn't really try to find that spider. I remember finding a few little webs under the couch in the living room, and those webs were very strange. The threads were too thick, as if it were a fake Halloween web. I had to peel them off the carpet. That's how strongly they stuck to it. I found a couple of such nests throughout the house, but never told my wife about them. One of those nests hit a hole in the floor that honestly should have worried me, but at the time I just ignored it. In fact, I was ignoring a lot. I found dead mice woven into cocoons, and another hole in one of the kitchen cabinets, which was completely covered in web. There was nothing normal about it, but for some reason I simply covered that hole with cans and went about my business. Now I can't explain my behavior back then. Maybe my attention was elsewhere. Lily was not in the best condition, and she was slowly getting worse. She cried a lot, and any little thing that touched her skin triggered countless panic screams. She couldn't eat without slapping her hands and neck every few seconds. Everything became really bad when I came back one night and saw that she was shaving her head. She told me she was tired of constantly feeling because of her hair as if a spider were crawling across her head. If you have ever lived with someone who had a nervous breakdown, there usually comes a moment when your heart sinks, when you realize that what you are dealing with goes beyond normal, and it's frightening. It reminded me of the time when my mom found a lump somewhere under her skin. I remember lying sleepless in bed that night and just seeing that picture before my eyes. How I find Lily bent over the bathtub with a razor in her hand, with her head shaved unevenly like that doll from Toy Story. When she looked back at me over her shoulder, she smiled, and her eyes were so wide that it seemed to me as if the person looking at me was no longer my wife. Have you ever missed someone while you are still living with them? Making them coffee and breakfast and chatting about your day, but as if that person is no longer there. Each of my days was the same. I told her about work, and she told me about how she scrubbed the bedroom from top to bottom in search of spiders, or began tearing off the tiles in the bathroom to check whether there were nests under them. At some point I thought she had taken a very long leave from her job, but she didn't tell me directly about it, so I had to call their office. They didn't even answer my calls, which I should have taken as a pretty bad sign. When she was transferred to the hospital ward, it became easier. That happened fairly soon. One day while I was at work, she tried to smash one of the walls with a sledgehammer to find out what was behind it. Not understanding that behind the wall was our neighbor's apartment, the situation escalated quite quickly, and the police came to our apartment to detain the bald woman yelling about spiders in the walls. By the time I got home, she had already been taken for evaluation to the local hospital. I rushed to her, but at the same time I had to call her parents. And that was, well, it was a relief, because I was no longer alone. Other people knew what was happening, and that made the task a little easier for me. Until then, I had been afraid to talk about it to anyone. I think I was a bit embarrassed, or maybe I simply didn't know how to properly discuss someone else's mental health issues in society. The neighbors agreed not to press charges if I paid for all the repairs, and Lily underwent therapy. Lily's parents are fairly well off, so they helped us with it. They found this clinic in which she stayed for a couple of weeks. She was sent for exposure therapy, which consists in the person getting used to the object of their phobia. Don't like water. You will spend every day in a swimming pool. Don't like moths. They will make you go into a room with a swarm of moths. I'm of course simplifying everything. It is a special program that implies a gradual increase of the nature of the exposure. On the first night she called me and said that they made her look at pictures of a spider and talk about her experience. These were just cartoon drawings, but she told me that it was still hard for her. She cried and I cried too. She was only a few hours drive away, but I didn't want to be away from her, and everything happened so suddenly. It had been only 6 weeks from the night when the storm began to when she ended up in that clinic, but in that short period of time I felt as if the ground had gone out from under my feet. She stayed there for 2 weeks. I remember them poorly. The calls were every night. She told me that she was getting better, and the doctor confirmed it. Of course, everything was still bad. They had to give her sedatives on the day when she went from cartoons to real photographs of spiders. Apparently she scratched an orderly very badly. At home I was extremely lonely and a bit strange, to be honest. One day I woke up with cobweb in my hair, and at some point I realized that I had not seen a spider in my house for a long time, not even a single small little spider. For a moment I wondered what the hell was leaving web all over the house, but I could not figure it out. It was hard for me to gather my thoughts. I remember how I found even more dead mice wrapped in web in the back of the kitchen cabinet. One morning I came downstairs and found a starling that had been wrapped into a cocoon outside the kitchen window. I just looked at it and drank coffee. Then I left for work, and when I came back, the starling was already gone. It's probably time to tell you that some time ago I was diagnosed with dementia. I guess that should explain everything, right? I don't know. It seems to me it doesn't matter. As far as I know, Alzheimer's disease did not occur in my family. They say that the neurons of the human brain with Alzheimer's look like a spider web with holes punched through it. That is a good way to describe how my mind works. Thoughts move along a set route and then just disappear. Lily's therapy, however, was progressing well. I remember that quite clearly. The phone calls and the sound of her voice are very vivid. God, how I missed her all that time. I hate being overly sentimental, but those were hard and lonely 6 weeks. And hearing her sound happier and more confident with each new phone call was like a shot of pure happiness straight into my veins. I missed her, and I wanted her to come back. And when she told me, giggling with joy, that on the 10th day she calmly held a small spider in her hands, I burst into tears together with her. I felt pride for her achievement, and I felt relief that everything might return to normal for all of us, as if this nightmare would finally end. It turned out not to be so simple when I saw her in person. She returned in such a state as if she had gone through a war. As a loving husband, I should have said that she looked wonderful, but I want to be extremely honest. I smiled when I saw her, but there was no smile in my eyes, because the woman who got into the car looked nothing like the woman who had lived with me just a few months earlier. She was thin as a stick, with ashy pale skin and a shaved head, which made her look like a matchstick. And her eyes, the look in them was already different, but she was smiling, so I swallowed the strange feeling that I had in my stomach and pretended everything was fine. She had long since been fired from her job, and I managed to arrange time off with my boss. We were home together all day, which was a little strange for us, since usually we both worked from 9 to 5. I was on edge, not knowing what to expect. She smiled a lot, tried her best to calm me, and I asked a lot about how the therapy was going, and she said everything was great, showed me photographs in which she sits next to large pet spiders, some the size of her palm. I had to swallow my arachnophobia while looking at those photos. She said that the photos were taken already on the 13th day from the start of therapy, but when I asked her what happened on the 14th, she said she was simply packing her things and saying goodbye to everyone. In relationships there is a dark and unpleasant truth, and it is that time flows only in one direction. My wife didn't do anything wrong and I truly didn't feel any malice toward her, but a distance had formed between us. She had changed. I suppose I had changed too. At that time I didn't know how to make sense of all this and accept it, but I wasn't sure how to treat her. I kissed her exclusively on the cheek when I hugged her. It was like a hug from a coworker. I myself didn't know what I felt until one morning I found her in the kitchen, knocking on the glass and giggling like a child. It was not that light and gentle laugh of a woman that I was used to. Her laugh rather reminded me of the laugh of a bunch of little kids egging on a bully to a fight. When I went into the kitchen, she looked at me. Then she turned to the glass and continued laughing, gently clicking on it with her fingers. When I went around the table, I saw under the glass a very big spider. I do not know whether this is considered normal in other countries, but in Britain a spider is considered big if together with its legs it is wider than a palm. This thing, though, was even bigger. Its legs twisted inside the glass on which my wife was clicking with her finger. Seeing it, I jumped back. I realized that I had not seen a single spider since the night when the storm happened, and this thing, curled up in the glass with legs as thick as pins, was a real shock to my nervous system. I screamed, and my wife, she began howling with laughter. I mean, it was the laughter that small children make when they first see cartoons, maniacal, damnably happy laughter. And in some way it was an extremely strange laugh, for I could not understand what emotions she was putting into it. I waited for her to say something, but she said nothing. She just laughed until she got tired. Then she slowly stopped laughing, still saying nothing. In the end, I broke the silence. I had no idea what to say. All this time she looked at me with that bristly hair on her head and joyful watery eyes. I wanted so desperately to break the silence that I mumbled, "He is big, right?" Her face relaxed, her shoulders lowered. She slipped out of this crazy image as if it were just a costume. "They will become bigger," she said, and then she lifted the glass, grabbed the spider, and shoved it into her mouth. It all happened very fast, and I almost did not have time to see anything, but I stood frozen with horror and watched how the muscles on her poorly shaved head tensed and relaxed while her jaw worked, crunching those hardened spider legs. Lord Jesus, those sounds were extremely unpleasant, but when she finished chewing she looked at me over her shoulder and smiled, and her teeth were smeared with green and black pieces of chitin that were stuck between her gums. I barely remember what happened next, but now I understood why I had felt this way next to her. Ever since she returned, I was afraid of her like a child next to an evil parent. I simply did not know what awaited me. Around her there always was this strange energy that kept me tense. I could sit in the living room and watch television, but in reality I was not watching television. If you had asked me what show I had just watched, I would not have been able to tell you. Instead, every ounce of my being was focused on her, every breath, every movement. When she stood up to go to the toilet, I watched her closely to see what she was going to do. The fact that she rarely did anything other than behave completely normally was even more disturbing, because I knew that something was wrong, and I could not stop remembering how she laughed back then in the kitchen, tapping the jar with the huge spider. The following nights were, to put it mildly, not very good. Often I woke up and felt that she was just watching me, but she usually slept soundly, or at least that was how it looked. Sometimes on the bed I felt how she suddenly turned. I got used to it. I thought that probably it all was just seeming to me. But one night I woke up and saw that she was hanging right above my face. I screamed. I could not hold back. I carefully slipped out of the bed, trying not to touch her, and fell onto the floor. When I lifted my eyes to her, I saw her completely empty facial expression. She just looked at me like a cat watching a fly. "What are you doing?" I shouted, unable to hold back the irritation coming through in my voice. She shrugged. "Just watching." Then she turned onto her side as if nothing had happened. That night I slept on the couch. She did not ask why, did not say a single word when I grabbed my things and went out of the bedroom. I was not sure that I would be able to fall asleep after that, but I did fall asleep, and when I woke up there was a web in my hair. I was lucky if I slept more than a few hours after that. I managed to sleep in short breaks. I too often woke up from the feeling that something was tickling my face and chest, the feeling as if someone was running a feather over me. Every time I woke up in panic, but I saw nothing and no one except the almost invisible web stuck to my skin. Because of lack of sleep, I was getting worse every day. I tried with all my might to hide my aversion to Lola. Over time, our habits and daily routine diverged even more. I almost completely stopped going upstairs. There simply was no need. I had my job, the couch, and the kitchen, and those days when I returned and almost did not see Lola suited me. I preferred to be far from her. To be honest, it broke my heart. There were times when I wanted to hug her, but one look at her caused in me a strange feeling in my stomach. I did not want to change anything, did not want to get closer to her. If anything, I wanted to run away. I do not mean that I wanted to run away from my life, adult responsibilities, or anything like that. I mean that I felt a strong desire to literally run away from her. I felt terrible emotions toward my wife, and the very attempts to realize this caused me headaches most days. I became very forgetful at that time, and a lot of time passed before I realized that I had forgotten to pay for the repair of the wall. I think it flew out of my head. I just nailed plywood to the hole and left it like that. And 3 months later, one day it suddenly came to my mind that I probably should have done something about it. I found in the kitchen a set of tools that was not mine. As soon as I remembered that for a long time I had done nothing about it, I was overwhelmed by a feeling of shame and embarrassment. I decided that the best thing would be to apologize to the neighbor. I do not know very much about this guy. He was an elderly man who liked football, he had a nose like a tomato, and he spent most nights in the pub. I knew that he lived alone, and when I knocked on his doors, nobody answered me. I did not consider this as something strange. At least it did not seem like anything unusual until I returned to my apartment and heard footsteps on the other side of the wall. Therefore, I returned and knocked a couple more times, thinking that he might not have heard me, but there was still no answer. This was already strange. He did not seem like the kind of guy who would avoid a neighbor he did not like. Earlier, he could easily open the door and send you far away. I went outside and decided to look into his windows. I saw nothing there. Then I went to his mailbox. There was a gray sheet across the mail slot. When I pulled this sheet out, I noticed that my fingers were covered with a sticky thread. I got a terrible feeling in my stomach. I could not explain how, but I was sure that Lily had done something. After all, it was the neighbor who had called the police, because of which she ended up in the hospital. But I could not just break down his door to check. I was not going to climb through windows. Luckily, we had a shared fence in the back garden. To jump over it was easy enough, and from there I checked the windows from that side of the house. He had left the kitchen blinds open, and at first what I saw confused me. For a moment I asked myself, what is he doing? That most of his house was covered with a thin semi-transparent film. He was doing some kind of repair or something like that, but it was enough for me to look closely to understand that there was little sense in this explanation. When you paint the ceiling, you do not throw a polyethylene sheet over half-drunk cups of coffee and plates with moldy food. The material with which everything in his house was covered was too cloudy for polyethylene, as if it were made of some silk. It took a lot of effort from me to hold back the desire to just jump back over his fence, but maybe he needed some kind of help right now. I knew that I had to at least try. I glanced at the porch near the back door. On its floor lay a lighter. Everything looked as if someone had left it there in a hurry. He could not just drop it and not notice it. It made no sense. I picked it up and winced when it came off the floor with a sticky, disgusting sound. The lighter was covered with barely noticeable web. God, how I wanted at that moment for that back door to be locked. I did something terrible. I took the handle and pressed it, and it went down. The door opened almost without effort. I could clearly see every inch of that house that was covered with pale web, which as I went deeper became thicker and thicker. I could not help but wonder whether this web was strong enough to hold a person inside it. My neighbor was there. Someone definitely was there. I heard it. The sounds came from the kitchen, but I saw no one. I wanted already to call him, maybe even go into the house and look for him myself, but the corridor looked like one very narrow tunnel entwined with web. The rounded walls of this cocoon gently fluttered because of the draft. I stared intensely into that darkness, trying with all my might to make out whether somewhere in the pale white web there was the outline of a person wrapped in a cocoon. I leaned forward. My head and shoulders had barely moved past the doorway when legs appeared out of the black tunnel. Dark shell and arthropod limbs literally flew in my direction so fast that this thing was already in the kitchen before my heart managed to make a single beat, and then it stopped halfway, freezing completely still and even boldly in the fading daylight. It was a spider the size of a horse, a real monster. I did not move. Lord Jesus, I needed another minute for my brain to realize what I was seeing. My nervous system worked faster. It was as if I was covered with a blanket of disgust and horror. My stomach seemed to fall inside itself. My skin crawled. My heart seemed about to burst, but my mind was empty. Only white noise and static. This thing was huge, so big that its legs reached the corridor behind it. In the kitchen, where there was a bit more space, its front limbs and mouth feelers stretched out before me, like antennae grabbing onto the doorway. It seemed as if it was ready to pounce on whatever had disturbed its web. I had read that spiders sometimes act like Venus flytraps. They do not always attack when there is a single touch on their web. They need several signals. When I looked down at my feet, I saw that I had taken only one step inside, but this was enough to draw it toward me. Now it had moved closer to me, half blind as if waiting for another step from me. I had to ask myself, and if I lift my boot to get out of here, will that serve as a trigger for it or not? Did I have a choice? I could not stay there. Looking at that damn thing, every second I was getting closer to full-scale panic. I needed to do something, and I needed to do it while fully controlling myself. I moved my leg back. The spider did not move. As soon as both legs were outside, I let go of the door handle and felt something sticky detach from my palm. It seems like an exaggeration to say that lightning moves slower. I am not sure I even have words to describe how fast everything happened. I am sure most of you have seen nature documentaries where spiders grab their prey lightning fast, and you thought, damn, that was fast. But this thing, maybe it only seemed so to me because it was flying right at me. I had never seen anything like it before. except in movies with 3D graphics. Before I managed to realize anything, thick hairy legs pressed me to the ground and I saw a pink mouth slit framed by fangs as long as my forearm. They moved independently of each other, and something in all those legs and joints converging together in the chest made my psyche tremble. Earlier I wrote that I had managed to somewhat rein in my arachnophobia, but everything has a limit. I lost consciousness. When I woke up it was dark around me. At that time I did not understand it, but the lair of the beast had once been my neighbor's living room. My eyes needed several horrifying minutes to adjust to the darkness. I was tightly wrapped. If you have ever heard stories that spider silk is stronger than steel and doubted it, well, trust me, it is true. When it is just a few thin threads you will not notice it, but I was wrapped in web half an inch thick, as if I were wearing 10 layers of clothing that were too small for me. I could barely move my fingers and toes and move my knee a little, but that was all. It was horrible. I am not claustrophobic, if anything, but considering the circumstances I panicked, trying to hook onto something. I kept thinking that if I managed to catch onto something with a finger maybe I could break free. I was desperate, but the more I struggled, the more I understood that it was hopeless. The web was elastic and strong. It was covered with thick and viscous glue which limited my movement even more. Because of my actions it spread even further. Only when exhaustion caught up with me and I had to take a small break did I realize that I was not alone here. Next to me there was another cocoon. My neighbor had been a large man in life, fat, with a big belly and a head like a big thumb. But in the dim light of that room he looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin, languishing in an ancient forgotten tomb. He was so thin and withered that his tendons were sticking out. I almost cried when I realized that I had risked everything to save a dead man, but in reality that wasn't true. I realized that I had mistakenly taken him for dead when he opened his eyes and stared at me with pure, unrestrained horror. He opened his mouth and I was sure that he was going to scream, but instead he began to cough and something wet and brown began to leak out of his mouth. This thing leaked onto his chin and poured onto the floor. It resembled a strand of hair drenched in bile, and I froze for a moment until I saw a thin brown leg coming out of that slurry. It's okay, my neighbor's body relaxed, his eyes became empty and confused, and Lily sank to her knees next to me and stroked my head. "Lily, get me out of here," I said, pressing one finger to my lips. "It's all right, everything will be fine." A shadow appeared behind her back. The legs of this shadow were as thick as my wrist, and they stretched all the way to the ceiling. "Not long to wait now," she added when the darkness behind her thickened. "It's probably best to just leave you here." "Lily, what the hell? I told you they would grow," she said, nodding toward the spider that my neighbor had just spat onto the floor. "He was of no use anyway." She touched my neighbor's head, but he barely reacted. He just stared blankly into nowhere. "For such a smart animal," she added, "I always wondered how you noticed so little." There was something behind my neighbor's head, a pulsing body of mottled brown skin and hairs. It looked like a spider without legs. Maybe a tick? That's what I thought until my wife ran her finger and mane along its back, and my neighbor let out a soul-rending screech of pain. This thing began to writhe and twist. Then a long leg appeared out of its body, and I realized that I was looking at a spider tightly wrapped around my neighbor's skull, whose legs were hidden under the skin and muscles of his scalp. For a moment, it playfully bent a leg in the air before returning it into the incision and sliding it back into place. Its legs sank inch by inch into the hole in the scalp with a horrible slippery sound. Then I saw how deformed my neighbor's skull had become from all those legs wrapped tightly around his head. "What the hell?" I exhaled. "Didn't it ever seem strange to you that you couldn't remember what that spider looked like on that very first evening? The one that ran out of her hand?" she asked before reaching out and stroking my head. Her hand was also in web. Something in her touch sparked disgust in me. It caused a strange shiver to run through my body. A deep primal need to run overwhelmed me. Again this strange disgust, the same one that taunted me again and again during the past few weeks. Even without wanting it, I found myself shuddering and panicking, my body trying to beat wildly, but I could do nothing because of this web wrapped around me. I tried with all my might to move my arms to catch the web and tear it off, to free myself, but everything was useless. I could do nothing but look at my wife and the huge shadow behind her, the one towering over both of us, its enormous legs clenched around the floor and ceiling. At some point I touched my pants, put my hand into my pocket, and felt something small and hard, a lighter. I knew it would be very risky to use it right now, but I had no choice. My wife seemed to understand what I was doing. She tilted her head like a curious dog when I clenched my fist around this small object and used all the remaining willpower I had to control the convulsive spasms that shook my body, and I pressed the button of the lighter. The web immediately flared up. It must be that this strange glue burns so well. The flame flared up on the web as if it had been soaked in kerosene. Before I realized that my cocoon had weakened enough for me to free one hand, the tongues of flame had already moved to the floor where they reached my poor neighbor. The feeling of burning that crawled along my legs and chest felt like nothing else, but I finally got free. I rolled over and began to push my body forward, desperately slapping myself to try to put out the flames. When I looked back, my wife and the figures following her had disappeared. For a moment I thought about helping my neighbor, but his body was thrashing too strongly, and although his eyes were wide open, small spiders were pouring from his mouth. I could not gather the courage to take even a step toward him. All I could think about was escape. The house was burning like a powder keg. It wasn't far to the kitchen, but the fire had already outrun me. Smoke billowed upward and, trapped under the ceiling, began filling the air, choking with soot. The only exit was the back door, and I trudged toward it, but at the last moment I was stopped by the figure of my wife standing there. "And you are truly a very interesting representative of your kind." I rushed past her, but to my surprise she offered no resistance. I just burst out into the open air. My lungs desperately gulped air. When I collapsed onto the tall grass, I looked back and saw how the orange tongues of flame were already jumping out of the windows on the upper floor. If it wasn't stopped, it would swallow all the nearby houses too. But in the distance, sirens were already wailing, so I understood that someone had called the firefighters. But it wasn't the end yet. Lily was sitting on the fence. I don't know how she ended up there, but she looked completely unperturbed. "I could never have imagined that when this wind blew me into your house, I would find such an interesting pair of people," she said. "What a funny consciousness to dip my little paws into. I had no idea what I would find there." "Let her go," I shouted. "Yes," she said, shrugging. "Yes, I did that several months ago. We were a bit incompatible, so it made sense to move out." She pointed at me and smiled. "And I liked living in your head." Trying to understand her words but still somehow realizing their horrifying meaning, I placed one hand on the back of my head and felt it. One touch was enough to fill my mouth with a copper taste while my vision blurred at the edges. Something under my skin shifted, and I felt horrible pressure behind my eyes. I needed to get rid of her. I knew only one weakness of this thing. "Well then," she said, watching me desperately search for the lighter. "Not all relationships have to last forever to be called meaningful." I set my hair on fire. All I remember is the heat and how that pressure from inside the skull suddenly lessened. I cannot describe it to you. Something seemed to slide out of my skull and Lily began waving at me before she disappeared from existence, and then nothing, not even darkness, just a complete absence of everything. I came to only several weeks later when I ended up in the hospital. Nothing remained of either house, but the firefighters had managed to get the fire under control before it spread to the others. I think the neighboring houses were also a bit damaged, and to this day I feel guilty about that. I think I was charged with arson and maybe with something else. I have vague memories of being taken into a courtroom. The doctors struggled over me for a long time, and one of them said something about an amateur trepanation. He said that I must have practiced on my wife. Also, judging by the body they found in the neighbor's house, I did it to my neighbor as well. But I don't know, I can't be sure of anything anymore. I constantly sink into reality and fall out of it. Writing this post was difficult. I don't quite understand where I am right now. One doctor said I might recover if it was just ordinary brain damage, but he had never seen anything like this before, so he couldn't be 100% sure. I get the impression that every day I see different doctors, every day a new attending doctor. On the other hand, I don't always recognize myself when I look in the mirror. Of course it could just be burns, but I think that even so I still look a little older than I should. There is one orderly whom I constantly see. He knows me by name, smiles a lot when he sees me, talks with me about various things. He seems genuinely interested in me and what I remember. Once I called him to get rid of a spider that had spun a web on the window outside, and he did it with a warm smile. I told him that I am deathly afraid of them, and he said he already knows that, but I shouldn't worry, because he will watch over me and make sure nothing bad happens. I'm glad he's here. Ever since he started working here, all the spiders that used to crawl around here constantly have disappeared somewhere. I hope spiders don't bother him too much, at least judging by the web in his hair.